Hello folks, this is Pastor Mike Hoggard, pastor of Bethel Church in Festus, Missouri, and head of prophetic research ministry with a very special edition of the Watchman video broadcast. This is actually the second part of a three-part video series that we're doing based upon Dan Brown's new book, The Lost Symbol. I happen to have a copy of it right here. I read this book from cover to cover, took a lot of notes on it, and people have been asking me what I think about it. Well, I think it's a 500-page brochure for Freemasonry. I think it's an advertisement for Freemasonry. Now, I will admit that I've been studying these things, knowing where Dan Brown was going for a long time. I've been studying these things for several years. And so most of the things that he wrote about in his book didn't catch me off guard, kind of like they did with the Da Vinci Code. So I've been studying this stuff for a while, and I'll tell you that there's a lot of things in here that we tried to uncover in the first video called Freemasonry Symbols Revealed. This one, we're going to deal with the structure and the architecture of Washington, D.C., because that's where the story takes place. We learned in the first video that Masons speak in symbols, and that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 11, and we'll look at that here in just a little bit. But I want you to kind of get this idea about mystery religions, because I think this whole concept of a mystery religion and the reality that there are secret groups, there are secret cults, there are religions that operate in secret. In fact, I will go ahead and say that I think that every religion in the world, other than true Bible Christianity, is a mystery religion. There's always something about it that most people are never going to know, and they're not going to know because it's concealed from them on purpose. But anyway, Masonry is a mystery religion. It is the new thing is we used to call them secret societies, and they don't come out and say, we're not a secret society. We're a society with secrets. Okay, well then let's reveal what that secret is, and let's look at the symbols that are in Washington, D.C. In the last video, we talked about what those secrets were, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing. You'll have to go back and watch the other video. I'm not going to get into the idea of the DNA and the 46 chromosomes and the body is a temple. I mean, you know all that stuff now because you watched the first video. So I'm going to assume that you know that. And if you don't, then stop it right here, put the other DVD in, and go back and watch it, and then come back and pick it up from this point forward. Because we're going to move forward, and I'm going to show you some things about the street layout of Washington, D.C., the architecture, the buildings, the monuments. We're going to go right into the heart of D.C. itself and find out exactly what it means. You could almost say that Washington, D.C. is a book without words. It is a Bible without words, but it's not the Bible that you and I are familiar with. It is the Bible, it's a secret Bible meant to conceal a secret that will be revealed in due time. Both Masons agree with this, the Rosicrucians, all the secret cults, the New Agers agree with this. But most importantly, the Bible says that all things that are hidden shall be revealed one of these days. By their very definition, Freemasons are builders. They are the offspring of the old stonemasons who built all the big buildings in Europe and the cathedrals in Europe and things like that. But let's go back. In fact, I want to get my Bible out here. Let's go back all the way to the book of Genesis, chapter 11, and let's discern something that God showed me here several years ago about Freemasons and about the roots of their organization. Genesis chapter 11. You remember this is right after the flood, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now Shinar is, you probably heard of the Sumerians. That is the land of Shinar. This is the whole area that was Babel and King Nimrod, we find out in Genesis chapter 10. In verse 3, here it is right here. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick. Now I want you to think about this. What kind of builders build with bricks? Masons. And burned them thoroughly, and they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. Now you know the whole rest of the story there in Genesis chapter 11. It has to do with the building of the Tower of Babel. Remember that Masons by their nature are builders. And so we look at it was Masons who built the Tower of Babel. It was the Masons who built the great pyramids of Egypt. It was stonemasons who built the great cathedrals of Europe, and without question, it was Freemasonry that influenced and directed the building of Washington, D.C. Now to start, we're going to go way back in history to a man by the name of John Dee. John Dee was a 16th century occultist and was an advisor to Elizabeth I. Now John Dee was demon possessed. He was following after what we refer to in the Bible as familiar spirits. John Dee was trying to get in contact. In fact, he claims that he had contact with angels. And through these angels, he had learned a secret language called the Enochian language. And so John Dee was a master of what is known in the occult world as Enochian magic. Now, in order to understand what makes Washington, D.C. so special, you kind of need to understand a little bit about this whole New World thing. I mean, here it is in Europe, and you have all these occultists springing up all over the place, the Age of Enlightenment and so on. And you have guys like John Dee and Francis Bacon and all these other scientists, pseudoscientists that were looking into occult things and alchemy and things like that. And all of a sudden they're hearing that there's this brave new land that's across the ocean somewhere. It was Francis Bacon, who was a disciple of John Dee, who decided that this was going to be what he referred to as a new Atlantis. Now Atlantis was this old myth, and I think it had everything to do with the pre-flood generations. But Atlantis was this whole utopia thing where there was this divine government ruled over by gods, and people had this advanced technology, and science was the rule of everything there, and there was a great fusion of religion and science together. So all these occultists are thinking about this, and they're looking at this new land called America, and they're thinking, you know, that's going to be our new world there. We need a new Atlantis capital city to have as this center point or the focal point of this New World Order that we know is going to come into play. Now, just take this concept New World Order and think about everything that we've learned about Freemasonry in the last video and what the agenda or what the secret that Freemasons hide. The idea that there is going to be a kingdom that comes to this earth. They are not part of this earth now. They're going to descend down to this earth. Daniel chapter 2 talks about that. And they're going to mingle themselves with the seed of men. And we'll see some of those things in the layout in the buildings of Washington, D.C. But anyway, I just kind of get this whole idea because that's what they're looking for in a city called Washington, D.C. Now, they picked this particular location, and this is things that I looked at several years ago. They picked this particular location because at the time of John Dee, Pope Gregory had come out with a new calendar. We call it the Gregorian calendar, and everybody uses it today. Well, most everybody uses it today. But England wasn't going to accept it. John Dee had actually come up with his own calendar system, a new way. It was based on the number 33 of all things, but it just never did work, and people didn't like it. And but he thought it was a really good idea. But now remember, he was the advisor to Elizabeth I. And so whatever he would have told Elizabeth I, that's what she would have done. Originally, John Dee was not going to go along with this Gregorian calendar. But he scratched his head and got his ink and paper out and started doing some figuring and ciphering and things like that. And he was looking at the map of the New World and looking at how things lay. And he realized, and I don't know how he figured this out, but he realized, and it dawned on him, that the vernal equinox, or the spring equinox, which is real special to the occultists and Freemasonry, and we learned about that in the last video, because the vernal equinox and the fall equinox have to do with equilibrium, or equality, or things that have balance. And if you remember the symbolism of that, that is two things fused together, or two kingdoms fused together, and so that's what the equinoxes represent. John Dee realized that there was one place in the world, one line of longitude in the world, where on March the 21st, now I'll tell you why that particular date in a minute, but on March 21st, John Dee realized that in a certain location, which we now know is the 77th meridian, we'll talk about that number here, he realized that at that particular place was on March 21st was when the vernal equinox occurred, and you had exactly 12 hours in the day and 12 hours in the night. And so he is the one that laid the, number one, the acceptance for the Gregorian calendar, because it put the vernal equinox on March 21st, and in this particular place, which we now know as Washington, D.C., the vernal equinox occurred, giving you 12 hours in the day and 12 hours in the night. Now, The reason why March 21st, I believe, is so significant is that it has a number attached to it. Number 1 is in the 3rd month, and the number 3 is always sacred and special to Freemasonry. It's the number for death and resurrection, but as we now know, it's the number for the triple helix, which is the adding of a 3rd strand demands 2-strand DNA. But another reason why they chose March 21st and its significance is because it's the 80th day of the normal calendar year. Now, when you have a leap year, that kind of throws it off a little bit. But in most years, the 80th day of the calendar year is March 21st. Now, this brings us to the specialism or the special significance of the number 8. And for our understanding of the number 8, we go to the Scriptures. We're not going to look at the occult or anything like that. Let's go to the Scriptures and find out exactly what the number 8 means. Revelation chapter 17, verse 10. And there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And so we know that Masons and the occultists, the New Agers, the Wiccans, they all use numbers or numerology, and to them, those things are sacred. And so everything that they do is always going to follow some sort of geometric pattern or some sort of numerical pattern. And oftentimes the geometry and the numerics go hand in hand. They're never separated from each other. So the 80th day of the year was chosen, March 21st. The location was pinpointed, the 77th meridian, and so now we have a place. The number 8 is also associated in the occult world. It's you see the number 8 is related to the infinity symbol. The infinity symbol is a picture of man becoming a god, which is the whole purpose of Freemasonry. The infinity symbol also shows the fusion of 2 things together, or the fusion of 2 worlds together. Do you remember September 11th, 2001, when the World Trade Towers collapsed? And we got a few more things to say about that. But on that day, after the towers collapsed, they erected 2 towers of light, and each one of those lights had 44 bulbs in them, giving you a total of 88. That number is significant to them. And by the way, those lights remained lit for exactly 33 nights. You're starting to get a clue here. But let's talk about the number 77 and why that particular number was used. It was anticipated that the new federal city, or this new utopia, or this new Atlantis, Washington, D.C., it was anticipated that it was going to be the center point of a new prime meridian on the earth. Now this takes us back to Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. You remember in the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown talked about the prime meridian, which is longitude 0, used to be in Paris, France. He called it the Rose Line because it symbolized the alleged bloodline between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now we know that that refers to something else. The sons of God, daughters of men, mingled together, and their offspring, which is the whole focus of the secret of Freemasonry. It was a veiled reference to the offspring of Osiris and Isis, whose name was Horus. You see here on one of the earlier maps of Washington, D.C., that it was anticipated that the federal city, or Washington, D.C., right down the middle of it, would be longitude 0, or a new prime meridian. Now, there for a while, all these cities were clamoring for being the location of the prime meridian. Paris wanted it, the United States wanted it, but it was finally decided that Greenwich, England would be the location for the new prime meridian, which, was no big deal to everybody, because then it placed the federal city, or Washington, D.C., upon longitude 77. Now the significance of this particular number is going to be seen in the pages of the Scripture. It has everything to do, remember, we're talking about from the Da Vinci Code how the longitude of the meridian line was a symbol of the rose line, or the supposed lineage of Jesus Christ. And so now we have the capital city, Utopia, sitting on longitude 77. What significance does this number play as far as the lineage or the offspring or the birth of Jesus Christ? Let's go to the book of Luke chapter 3. In Luke chapter 3 verse 23, the Bible says, "And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being as he was supposed the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli." And if we move all the way down, the Bible gives a whole lineage here, and we move all the way down to Luke chapter 3 verse 38, The Bible says which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. So if you do what I did, and that is you go to your Bible and you count from Jesus to God here in Luke chapter 3, you'll have a total of 77 names in the lineage that produced Jesus Christ. So I want you to get this in your mind, because that number is significant to them. So here we have the capital city, and what we're going to see in this video is all of these sculptures and images and street layouts. They all point to the dawning of a new age and a new world and the birth of a new Christ on the earth. So the number 77 being about the production or the coming of the Messiah on the earth. So here we have a utopia city built on longitude 77. Now let me give you a little sideline information to kind of show you how this works. Do you remember on September 11th, 2001, not only did we have the Twin Towers fall, which I believe were a picture of the two pillars of Freemasonry, Jachin and Boaz, being destroyed so that a new one could come up in its place. Go back to the first video and get information on that. But the Pentagon also was destroyed. Now some people say it was a plane, some say it was a missile. I don't know what it was, but I know that I know the Pentagon was the target of this particular scenario that played out on September 11th, 2001. We're going to see more about it. But do you know how tall the Pentagon building is? It's exactly 77 feet tall. Do you remember what flight it was that flew into the side of the Pentagon building? Well, it was Flight 77. In Texas, there's a highway called Highway 77. Now, this highway goes through Waco, Texas. You remember back years ago, the Branch Davidian compound that was burnt down to the ground, and David Koresh? That Branch Davidian compound was near Waco, Texas. Waco, Texas is on Highway 77. By the way, guess how old David Koresh was? He was 33 years old. Highway 77 goes northward into Dallas, Texas. In fact, Elm Street, you remember the whole thing about Dealey Plaza where John F. Kennedy was assassinated? On the 11th month, the 22nd day, let's see, that's a number 33 as well. But these three streets that make up Dealey Plaza go into what's called the Triple Underpass, and those head and intersect right at Highway 77. Highway 77 then goes northward into Oklahoma City, where you find the Alfred P. Murrah building. Alfred P. Murrah was a 33rd degree Freemason, supposedly bombed by Tim McVeigh, and Tim McVeigh was executed. Guess how old he was? He wasn't 77. He was 33 years old. Now let's look at a tale of two cities. One is called Heavenly Jerusalem. The other city is called Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. Now these represent the two opposites that you see all the time in the scriptures. You have, and by the way, let me say this. The word city in the King James Bible is found in exactly 777 verses of the Bible. Now that's interesting because here we have a guy that we're going to talk about in the next video by the name of Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley happened to write a book called 777 and Other Kabbalistic Writings of Aleister Crowley. This book was all about the Kabbalah, which is about the divine man and numerology. But, let's hook the train back up again and let's talk about these two cities for a minute. Let's get a biblical explanation of them both. First, let's talk about Heavenly Jerusalem, which that's where I want to be one of these days. Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The opposite of that would be a new world order. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God. Now this verse shows you that God already has a plan for man's eternity. And that is that at some point, and we believe that after the millennial reign of Christ occurs, that God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth. And now heaven and earth are going to be joined together or bridged together without sin. It will be the utopia that all these occultists keep wanting. But heaven and earth will be joined together by a new city called New Jerusalem. It is pictured as a beautiful bride adorned for her husband. husband, a virgin bride who is prepared for the great wedding of Christ and His church. And what a glory that's going to be. But then we have another city that would be its exact opposite. Heavenly Jerusalem comes from heaven down to earth, and it's a virgin bride. This other city called Babel is a harlot city that seeks to go from earth to heaven. Let's look at Genesis chapter 10 to find the builder of this new city. Genesis chapter 10 verse 8, and Cush begat Nimrod. Remember, Cush was of the cursed lineage of Ham. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. Some say that he was actually a giant. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So if you've heard a lot of stories about the Sumerians and about some of these things about giants and the Anunnaki and all this stuff, which you ought not believe. You ought to just believe the biblical account of it and you'll be okay. But Nimrod was the one who established the first kingdoms on the earth, and he built a town or a city called Babel. Then we go back to Genesis chapter 11. Let's look at this verse again. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So remember, God has a city that descends from heaven down to earth. God Himself is going to bridge the gap between He and mankind. Mankind, however, led by Lucifer, has a different plan. That is not to let God descend down, but to try to elevate man upward. And so they're going to build a tower, a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven. That plan is still in existence today. Here is a graphic of an artist depiction of the Tower of Babel. And here is a photograph of the European Union Parliament building. It is the new Tower of Babel. Now, what we're going to focus on in this video is the fact that I believe that Washington, D.C. was intended to be the capital city, not just of America, but of a new world order. And remember, what better place to build a new world order than in the new world? So here this new land was chosen, and this street was laid out. Now you look at an aerial picture or a map of Washington, D.C., and you see all these lines intersecting all over the place. This was because Washington, D.C. was laid out on the basis of what's called sacred geometry. Sacred geometry is one of those things, there's another term for it called geomancy. It's an effort to use divination or to send a secret message by way of locations or symbols or lines that are upon the earth. Some people refer to them as ley lines. And they believe that these lines and these buildings and these monuments all have this special significant power that will bring in or usher in a new world. It's kind of like, you remember that movie, The Field of Dreams, where, Kevin Costner kept hearing that thing in his ear, if you build it, they will come. That's kind of the concept behind Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was built more or less as an invitation to this new world order that is going to be established based upon Daniel's fourth kingdom mentioned in Daniel chapter 2. Now the thing about all these intersecting lines and the street layouts and the map and things like that, that if you're walking the streets of Washington, D.C., you're driving through them, none of these things really make sense. They only make sense when they're viewed from above. Most people for years who never saw a map of Washington, D.C. didn't know that there was a pentagram there. And we'll see that here in just a little bit. But it's amazing what we're finding out now that we have the ability to fly over or use satellites, Google Earth, to see these things firsthand. Not just look at them on a map, but to see these things firsthand. It's sort of like, remember when the Nazca lines were discovered. Here you had all these intersecting lines and images and things like that nobody saw for years until a guy flew over it from an airplane and said, what in the world is that? And there have been scientists and conspiracy people that have speculated about what the meanings of these things are. But the truth of it is, these things only make sense from above. Here you have Stonehenge, the images on Easter Island, the Great Pyramids, which happen to align with the three stars in Orion's belt. These things, I think, are meant to be like an invitation or a concept that says Bring it on. We're ready for a new world order. Now let's get back to Washington, D.C. As we mentioned a while ago, the first thing that stands out in your mind is that there's this big giant pentagram built into the street layout of Washington, D.C. If you remember from Dan Brown's earlier book, The Da Vinci Code, the pentagram is a symbol for what he referred to as the sacred feminine, or that women are goddesses because of their ability to procreate and produce life. And so Dan Brown used that concept of the sacred feminine in his book, The Da Vinci Code, and he tells you, and this is actually true, that the pentagram, or the symbol of the pentagram, is based upon what's called the Venus transit. The planet Venus in our skies, which we a lot of times refer to as the morning star, but sometimes it rises in the morning, sometimes it rises in the evening. And over an 8-year period, astronomers began to realize that the planet Venus will actually draw a 5-pointed star, or a pentagram, in the sky. And like I said, it takes 8 years to do this. The interesting thing about the planet Venus, though, is that during this 8-year cycle, when it's drawing this big pentagram in the sky, is that it revolves around the sun exactly 13 times. Now, this gives us an occult connection with the city of Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And the reason why I'm saying that is, in your King James Bible, you will see in Revelation chapter 17 that the name of the woman, now remember, we're talking about two cities here. We're talking about heavenly Jerusalem, which is the virgin bride of Jesus Christ, and we're talking about Mystery Babylon the Great, which is a harlot woman, and she is the wife of the beast. She is riding the beast, Revelation chapter 17. But in your King James Bible, you will note that this woman has a name written on her forehead. And in all capital letters, you find the name, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. A 13-word title. The number 13 in the Bible has to do with the love of God. The great charity chapter in the Bible is 1 Corinthians chapter 13. The phrase love of God is mentioned 13 times in the King James Bible. But you also have, that's God's pure love. Harlot love is the exact opposite of pure love. Remember the two opposites that we're dealing with here. The number 13 is also a sacred number in the occult and in Freemasonry. In the York Rite of Freemasonry, there are 13 levels. If we look at the mural of George Washington in the Capitol Rotunda, we find that George Washington is surrounded by 13 goddesses. Those goddesses are representatives of Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. When we look a little bit closer at this mural, we find that the image of George Washington, which we're going to talk about later, is surrounded by 72 stars or 72 pentagrams. The number 72 is a veiled reference to the pentagram. There are exactly 72 degrees in the exterior angles of a regular pentagram. And in the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah is everything that God told the Israelites not to learn from the Canaanites and the Hittites, that they went ahead and learned. And they fused it together into what they knew about Jehovah, and it was the Jewish form of the mystery religion. The Kabbalah plays heavily into the concepts of Freemasonry. In the Kabbalah, there are 72 names of God. So now you understand that the number 72 is a veiled reference for the pentagram, and the pentagram itself is a symbol for, as Dan Brown pointed out, the sacred feminine, the concept of Venus, and it specifically references the morning star. In Manly Hall's book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, he teaches you that in the Great Seal of the United States of America, the unfinished pyramid, there are exactly 72 stones in there. In the National Archives building, you remember that's where the secret map was located in the movie National Treasure. In the National Archives building, that building is surrounded by 72 pillars. Now back to this pentagram. When you look at the aerial view of the street layout of Washington, D.C., I mean, you obviously see a pentagram there. And it's been noted by some Masonic authorities that this is not really a pentagram because there's like one part of it missing. And we'll talk about that in a minute because it's very interesting what we found out about this. But anyway, the apex of this pentagram just happens to be the White House, you know, where the President of the United States lives and does all of his work there. Exactly 13 blocks north of the White House, and here's that number 13 connection with the pentagram. Exactly 13 blocks north is the Masonic House of the Temple Lodge in Washington, D.C. Now, it's like I said before, it was noted by certain Masonic authorities who ridicule this idea that people see a pentagram there and they say, no, you don't, that's crazy, you don't see anything like that there, is that it's not a pentagram. They say it's not a pentagram because there's like one piece of it missing. Let's go back to the authorities that Dan Brown based his book, The Lost Symbol, on. One of those was Manly P. Hall, who wrote a book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Here's what Manly Hall said about this particular pentagram. He said, the pentagram is the figure of the microcosm, the magical formula of man. It is the one rising out of the four. The four here that he's talking about would be the four base pairs of your DNA, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, joining together to make the DNA ladder. Remember, the concept is that they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, which means that they will add something to man's DNA. So here you have a figure that represents the number 4 with something else added to it. That is the nature of the pentagram. He says it is the one rising out of the 4, the human soul rising from the bondage of the animal nature. It is the true light, the star of the morning. It marks the location of 5 mysterious centers of force, the awakening of which is the supreme secret of white magic. Now, he mentioned in this, and this is what really gets me, he mentioned in here the star of the morning. That is a variant of what we see in the King James Bible concerning Lucifer. You know who Lucifer is. He's the dragon, the devil, that old serpent, the deceiver of mankind. He is the one who wants to sit on God's throne and have everybody worship him. And that plan is seen in Isaiah chapter 14, beginning in verse 12. Lucifer is the fallen angel. And what we see in the image of the pentagram, we see a number. That number is the number 5. And so here in Isaiah chapter 14, we see Lucifer's 5-point plan. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, number 1, I will ascend into heaven. Number 2, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Number 3, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. Number 4, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. And number 5, I will be like the Most High. His plan is to ascend into heaven and sit in the throne that God currently sits on right now. That is the meaning, the real true meaning behind the pentagram. So here we have, remember our concept of 2 cities now. We have heavenly Jerusalem and we have Mystery Babylon the Great. Mystery Babylon the Great wants to ascend. She wants to rise up. Her symbol then is the pentagram because it represents the plan of Lucifer to take over the authority away from God in heaven. You remember back in Isaiah 14, it said, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? Then we take that concept of the number 5, we go to the book of Revelation when the trumpet judgments are sounding, and we find in Revelation chapter 9, verse 1, the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. We talked about that key in the last video. That key actually opens up the pit and releases Abaddon, Apollyon, whose name is another Jesus. That's how Paul referred to him. John referred to him as the Antichrist. And so here we have this concept in Washington, D.C. that it conceals, but it also is going to reveal the coming of a new Messiah upon the earth, the Antichrist. Now, getting back to that idea that it's not a pentagram in Washington, D.C. because there's a line missing, let's look at what Manly Hall said about that missing line. He said, the pentagram is used extensively in black magic, but when so used, its form always differs in one of 3 ways. The star may be broken at one point by not permitting the converging lines to touch. It may be inverted by having 1 point down and 2 up. Or it may be distorted by having the points of varying lengths. See, all 3 of those apply here. When used in black magic, the pentagram is called the sign of the cloven hoof, or the footprint of the devil. The star with 2 points upward is also called the goat of Mendes, because the inverted star is the same shape as a goat's head. When the upright star turns and the upper point falls to the bottom, it signifies the fall of the morning star. That is exactly what we read in the pages of the Scripture. And remember, Manly Hall is not a conspiracy. He's not Mike Hoggard. Manly Hall is sort of like the great philosopher of Freemasonic thought. I mean, this guy has a huge library, thousands upon thousands of volumes, and he knew a lot about the occult, and he knew a lot about the secret teachings, and he didn't make this stuff up. This is at the core of the idea of why there's a pentagram there. But the pentagram reveals something that I think is, of course, it goes along with Isaiah 14 and the rule of Lucifer over the universe. Lucifer is the great architect of the universe. I don't know if you knew that, but it is Lucifer. He is the god of Freemasonry. But it also has a more diabolical meaning than that. Remember the whole concept of male and female together, the fusion of opposites, the sons of God mingling with the daughters of men. Former Freemason and occultist Bill Schnablin says that the pentagram has one use only, and that is to call up the power of Satan and bring the kingdom of the devil into manifestation on the earth. Kathy Burns wrote in her Masonic and Occult Symbols this description of what the pentagram was used for in ritual magic. She says the great rite invocation specially declares that the body of the woman taking part is an altar with her womb and generative organs as its sacred focus and reveres it as such. The high priestess then lays herself down towards the altar and her arms and her legs outstretched to form the pentagram. That concept, or the imagery of that concept, is seen in this DC comic book called Night Force. Here you see this woman who is about to take part in a sacred ritual called the Great Rite Ritual. Now, out of decency, I won't go into all the details, but basically the Great Rite Ritual is about a woman who becomes a pentagram, and then the high priest of the coven goes in and couples with her. That is fornication, the Bible calls it, but it's the sacred fornication, or the concept of the sacred feminine, or as we learn from the Da Vinci Code, what's called hieros gamos. The Gnostics believe that every human being has a spark of divinity inside of him, and that divinity will rise up to full-blown godhood by way of a certain ritual. That ritual is the Great Rite Invocation, ritualistic fornication. So I want you to think about this for a minute. The concept, here we have a building that is a pentagram. It's called the Pentagon. And remember, it's an altar. And a woman takes the shape of an altar. So September 11th, 2001, you have occult symbolism taking place. You have the Pentagon, a symbol for the sacred feminine, Mystery Babylon the Great, the daughters of men. You have an airplane, Flight 77. Remember, that's about the producing of the false Christ. You have an airplane, Flight 77, flying into a 77-foot tall building, and the imagery is that of the union of the male and the female. Now let's go back to this pentagram thing that we see in the street layout of Washington, D.C. At the tops of this pentagram, you can see circles up there. These are circular streets that have intersections that are going into it. This is called, in Masonic imagery, the point within the circle. The point within the circle, here again, is another symbol. We talked about this in the last video. It is another symbol for the fusion of male and female together, or the fusion of opposites. The point represents the male. The circle represents the female. Albert Pike said the hieroglyphic of the younger Horus, who was the offspring of Isis and Osiris, was the point inside of a circle. Dan Brown gives a very revealing explanation of the point within a circle, which he calls the circumpunct, in his new novel, The Lost Symbol. He says, in ancient Egypt, it was the symbol for Ra, the sun god, and modern astronomy still uses it as the solar symbol. In Eastern philosophy, it represents the spiritual insight of the third eye, the divine rose, and the sign of illumination. The Kabbalists use it to symbolize the Kether, the highest Sephiroth, and the most hidden of all hidden things. That then would be a reference to the Antichrist. Early mystics call it the eye of God, and it's the origin of the all-seeing eye on the Great Seal. The Pythagoreans used the circumpunct as the symbol of the monad, the divine truth. The Prisca Sapienta, the at-one-ment of mind and soul. So the point within the circle in all of Masonic ideology is one of the most important symbols that you will ever see. And it represents basically the fusion of male and female together and the production of their offspring, which is the Antichrist. You see it in Washington Circle, which is at the north part of that pentagram. DuPont Circle, you have the point within the circle. Logan Circle, here again, a point within the circle. When we move over to Lincoln's Memorial, you see that it represents a point within the circle. We go across the bay and we find the Jefferson Memorial, here again, a point within the circle. Now I want to show you a graphic, and this really got me when I was doing the research for this video, because as I said earlier, some of this stuff I've seen several years ago, but there are things changing right now to fit the idea that Washington, D.C. is the focus point of a new world order revealing the Antichrist in the last days. I want you to take a look at another point within the circle. This is the Washington Monument. Notice that we have a point within a circle, but I want you to notice something else too. We also have two circles that join together to form in the middle, where the Washington Monument is, a symbol called the mandorla. Now, I'm going to tell you that this symbolism here was just recently put there. I don't know when, but it was just recently put there. I'm going to show you an older image from Google Earth, and this is where we're getting the images from. An older image from Google Earth, and I want you to see then that those two circles were not there a few years ago. They've just been put there. Now, those two symbols coming together form what's called the mandorla. That symbol, we found out from Dan Brown's earlier book, The Da Vinci Code, was a symbol specifically that refers to the sacred feminine. It's called a mandorla because the word mandorla is an Italian word for almond. It has an almond shape to it. Specifically, the shape of this symbol is the female generative organ. The two circles coming together then show the fusion of things that are opposite. The heavenly kingdom or the angelic kingdom fusing themselves with the earthly kingdom on the earth to form a new world order government, a new leader called the Antichrist, and a new human being, the divine man. The symbol itself of the female generative organ basically goes along with annuit coeptus, which means the birth or the undertaking of a new world order. The mandorla symbol can be seen in religious icons. Here is an image of the Virgin Mary, who is the sacred feminine, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. Here's another image of a Christ-like figure being born through this image. This image here is of the Chalice Well in England, where supposedly the Holy Grail was, the blood of Christ was poured into this, and water that flows from this well is red, and they built this little spring well from this Chalice Well to form the symbol of the divine mandorla. And I'm going to throw this one in just in case you're not buying it so far. Last year there was a movie came out called The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now this movie was based upon an older movie back in the 50s. And of course, now get this now, this movie is about aliens coming down to the earth to make mankind better. And that's exactly what happens. The imagery that you see at the very beginning of this movie is the imagery of two circles coming together to form the mandorla, the idea of the two opposites joining together to form a new world or a new world order. Back to the point within the circle, we go all the way to the Vatican, and here we find, you remember the Washington Monument, here we find an obelisk there. This obelisk actually came from Egypt and was placed within the Vatican, and here it represents the point within the circle. Dan Brown reveals that the mural that is in the ceiling of the Capitol Rotunda forms the circumpunct or the point within the circle. Now let's look at another location in Washington, D.C. to see a lesser-known emblem or a lesser-known symbol that is in the street layout of Washington, D.C. It's called the hexagram. Now, a hexagram is basically two triangles that are fused together. One of them is pointing upward, and one of them is pointing downward. A triangle in Masonic ideology is a representation of the number 3. So when you have these two triangles formed together, it is a veiled reference to the number 33. Dan Brown brought out in the law symbol that a hexagram symbol can be formed on the Great Seal of the United States of America on the back of a $1 bill. He says that when a hexagram is placed over the pyramid on the Great Seal of the United States, that the points point to letters that are in Anno et Coeptus Novus Ordo Seclorum. Those letters, when linked together, makes the word Mason. Now, I don't know if that was actually designed that way or that just happens to be that way, but I will tell you that on the other part of the Great Seal of the United States, we see 13 stars emblazoned there above the eagle's head. Those stars are lined up to form a hexagram. In fact, dealing with the number 13, we have 13 stars. There are 13 rows of stones in the unfinished pyramid on the other side of the Great Seal. You have 13 berries on the vine of the eagle's claw. You have 13 flowers on that vine. You have 13 arrows. You have the phrase e pluribus unum, which has 13 letters in it, but e pluribus unum is a very revealing Latin phrase. And you know what it means. It means out of many, one. This is the concept behind a new world order or a new kingdom that's coming, and it basically represents they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men and be one kingdom. Literally, out of many becomes one. Manly Hall referred to in the Secret Teachings of All Ages that the six-pointed star was a figure for the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone is a veiled reference to the Antichrist and basically is the fusion of the two opposites together that will bring divinity or immortality to mankind. If you remember, when the first Harry Potter book came out, it was titled in this country, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. But in Europe and in other places, it was referred to as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Manly Hall goes on to say in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, these triangles symbolize the spiritual and material universes linked together in the constitution of the human creature. So Manly Hall is saying that these triangles joined together show the fusion of these two opposite kingdoms, the sons of God and the daughters of men. Now I'm going to show you an overhead picture of Washington, D.C. itself. When Charles L'Enfant first laid out the parameters of Washington, D.C., the lines formed what we see as a cube or a diamond shape. Now this diamond is divided in half by what is referred to as the point of transformation, and that line is the National Mall, where the Capitol building is and Washington's monument and all these things that we are going to see in this video. That is the line of transformation. This diamond-shaped figure is actually the two parts or the two triangles of a hexagram. And it shows the fusion of the two kingdoms. One triangle pointing upward, one triangle pointing downward. The fusion of the two kingdoms together, and the center point being the National Mall of Washington, D.C. The hexagram is also a veiled reference to the number 6. And it's in Genesis chapter 6 that we see the revealing of what this kingdom is going to be. Genesis chapter 6, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now the sons of God are the angels, or the fallen angels. Some refer to them as the Nephilim, which means the fallen ones. They are the fallen angels who left, Jude says they left their first estate, and they mated with human women, and they produced offspring. Some people don't believe that, but every mythology and every concept in the world, in all civilizations, they all have a similar story that the gods came in, procreated with human women, and created a super race. They created the fusion of the opposites, or the divine man. And so that is the meaning of the symbol of the hexagram. So when we look again at the street layout of Washington, D.C., you see there an image there, and you can just barely make out the image of the hexagram there. Starting with the Capitol building, working down to a little rectangular park called the Lincoln Square, or Lincoln Park, you can clearly see in the points and the intersecting lines of this street layout here, the emblem of the hexagram. Now, one of the more interesting concepts behind the hexagram, and Da Vinci caught on to this, and he actually, I think he drew a graphic of this somehow, is that if you take two three-dimensional triangles and you put them inside of a globe, the points of those triangles would touch on the outer points or the outer part of that globe, at exactly 19.5 degrees. Now, this number is really interesting to me because I want you to notice that on top of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., there is a symbol of Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. There's a statue of a goddess there. Dan Brown points this out, and it's commonly known that this statue stands exactly 19 feet 6 inches. Once again, if we look at the layout of Washington, D.C., you see the Capitol building, you see the White House, and you see Washington's monument, and those form a right-angled triangle, and the degree of separation of those two lines is exactly 19.5 degrees. Now, this is very interesting, because every 4 years in this country, we elect a president. Sometimes it's a new president, sometimes it's the same president. Sometimes we like the president, sometimes we don't. And there have been a few exemptions of this, but normally, the president of the United States is inaugurated at the center point or the focal point of this right-angled triangle, the capital of Washington, D.C. The president is inaugurated, and it's done so by law every 4 years on January the 20th at exactly 12 noon. Now, I want you to think about this, because in the calendar, starting at January 1st, exactly on January 20th at 12 noon, exactly 19 and a half days have expired into the year, and a new president is inaugurated. Right underneath a 19 and a half foot statue of a goddess. Now, what is the hidden meaning behind this 19.5 symbolism? This is very simple. We go back to the pages of the Scriptures, and we find out, and when you take the measurements of the Ark of the Covenant, and remember, the Ark of the Covenant is the throne or a representation of the throne of God. And remember, Lucifer wants to rise up to heaven and sit on God's throne. When we look at the exact measurements of the Ark of the Covenant, we find that the surface area of the Ark of the Covenant is exactly 19.5 cubits. Notice what Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 2 says. Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus. This is referencing Lucifer. Thus saith the Lord God, because thine heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he is God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Naturally, you can sort of see the symbolism behind seating a president or the leader of the New World Order, United States of America, as sort of the grand authority over a New World Order. Now, one of the central symbols of the lost symbol written by Dan Brown was the unfinished pyramid and the illuminated eye capstone. If you've read the book, you'll know that they're running around Washington, D.C. with this sort of unfinished pyramid symbolism in the hand. It's supposed to be the key to unlocking the great mystery of Freemasonry. Actually, they're really not far from the truth here in this book, because it is a very significant symbol. We see it on the back of the $1 bill, the unfinished pyramid with the illuminated eye capstone being added to it. Manly P. Hall says in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, the sacredness of the triad and its symbol, the triangle, is derived from the fact that it is made up of the monad and the duad. The monad is the symbol of the divine Father, and the duad of the Great Mother. So here again, get this symbolism. We have the concept of a divine Father, which would be Lucifer, and we have the concept of the Mother, which would be planet Earth. The two of them joining together. The capstone is the Father. The base of the bottom of the pyramid is the Divine Mother. The bottom 2 points, that is referred to as the duad, represent the two strands of human DNA. The capstone, or the monad, or the Father, basically represents the seed of the sons of God, and these two now are joined together to form the divine man. In other words, they're saying that human DNA is incomplete without the addition of this third part. let's look again here at the street layout of Washington, D.C. Remember, and I didn't point this out earlier, but the street layout of Washington, D.C. was laid out by three people. Charles L'Enfant, who we know was a Freemason, George Washington, who we know was a Freemason, and an interesting figure by the name of Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker was a very skilled, he was an African-American, but he was a very skilled astronomer, astrologer, and he was a very skilled surveyor. And these three worked together to form what we now see as the layout of Washington, D.C. So you have two Masons and an astrologer, people who believe in occult ideas and occult symbolisms, and they have put these symbols into the layout of Washington, D.C. Now I'm going to show you a graphic. We're going to turn it so that you can kind of understand where we're going here. We see then the formations of an unfinished pyramid with a capstone on top of it. You see the bottom part of the triangle there forming part of Pennsylvania Avenue, and the illuminated capstone or the illuminated eye at the top of the pyramid, or the monad, or the great Lucifer as it were, represents the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Now remember, this is significant because it's at this exact location, the illuminated eye capstone on the unfinished pyramid, that every 4 years we inaugurate a new president of the United States. This same street layout is also part of another symbol, and Masons like to use multiple symbols upon symbols when they are writing their book without words that reveal an Antichrist coming in the last days. They like to use multiple symbols. And so on this layout here, where we find the unfinished pyramid with the illuminated eye capstone, the Capitol building, we find the symbol of the square and the compass. Now, the square and compass seems to be the most prominent and predominant symbol of Freemasons. They use this thing just about everywhere. You go by in your town, you'll find a Masonic lodge. More than likely, you'll find the square and compass out there. Here's a quote. We talked about this on the last video. Here's a quote from Albert Pike, and he talks about the symbolic meaning of the square and the compass. He says, "The square, therefore, is a natural and appropriate symbol of this earth. The compass is an equally natural and appropriate symbol of the heavens. The compass is the hermetic symbol of the creative deity, the male, and the square of the productive earth, or the universe." And that's from Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. So here Albert Pike is revealing that the square and compass show the fusion, just like the unfinished pyramid with the capstone shows the fusion of the two opposite kingdoms mentioned in Daniel chapter 2. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. That's the meaning behind the square and the compass. So in our overhead view of Washington, D.C., you see Washington's monument, and from that point go out two lines or two streets. Then we look down to the Capitol building, and from that point outward or westward, we have two lines also going out, forming the square and the compass. Now, here's the interesting part of all of this, is that here we have the Washington's monument, which is known as an obelisk or Baal's shaft. It is basically Baal's phallus, his male organ. So the Washington monument represents the male. Remember, on top of the Capitol building, we have a 19.5-foot statue of a goddess, the female. Those two joining together to produce the divine man on planet Earth, or revealing the Antichrist. The square and compass themselves are emblems of the triangle in Freemasonry. The triangle, you remember, is a symbol that represents the number 3. And 3 is sacred in all of Freemasonry because it represents the divine man, or the union of things that are opposite together. When you go into a Masonic lodge, you will usually find 3 candles there around the altar. These are called the lesser lights of Freemasonry. These 3 candles, or 3 lights, usually in the form of what's called a right-angled triangle, or a Pythagorean triangle. Pythagoras was a philosopher. You remember from the last video, we talked about him. Lived about 500 years before the time of Christ. And he's the one that devised what was called the Pythagorean theorem. The Pythagorean theorem, again, basically goes like this. The square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. Hence, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And let me explain what this means in layman's terms. I'm not a mathematician, but I kind of get this. If you were to take a right-angle triangle and take the first line in that angle, which would be line A, and you were to square the length of that line, that would be a squared. The bottom line of that triangle would be line B. If you were to take the length of that line and square it, that would be b squared. If you take a squared, the length of the square of this line, and the square of this line, and add them together, then you get the sum of the square of the hypotenuse. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now, in all of the mystery concepts and all Freemasonry and everything, here's what they teach about a squared plus b squared equals c squared. A squared is the male, Osiris, which represents the sons of God or the Iron Kingdom. B squared is the female, Isis, the daughters of men, the clay kingdom. Their coming together results in the fusion, which is represented by C squared, or the square of the hypotenuse, which we now refer to as the Antichrist, or Horus, their offspring, the divine man. Looking again at our map of Washington, D.C., we see what's referred to as Federal Triangle. This is where most of the government buildings in Washington, D.C. are located. I mean, you have a bunch of them in there. Some of the most powerful men, not only in our country, but in the entire world, when they go to work every day, they go to work to this little area called the Federal Triangle. Following a line from the White House down to Washington's Monument, from Washington's Monument over to the Capitol Building, and then from the Capitol Building back to the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue, you have what's called the Federal Triangle. This is a right-angled triangle, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Here again, most of these buildings are located in the area of c squared, the area that represents the divine offspring of the two kingdoms fused together. And here again, in this imagery, when you have a president of the United States who is inaugurated at the illuminated eye in the capstone at the Capitol Building, Washington, D.C., he is inaugurated there, and then he makes a journey down Pennsylvania Avenue, down the hypotenuse of this triangle, which represents the divine man, going from the Capitol to his home or his office in the White House. Triangles themselves are symbols, sacred symbols in Freemasonry, that represent the divine man, or the birth, the death, and the resurrection of mankind together. That's also symbolic of the phoenix. The phoenix dives into the fire, is killed, and out of the ashes is resurrected a new life or a new divine person. This concept of the number 3 and how it represents all of this is based upon the scriptures. The number 3 actually reveals the man of sin. Back to Genesis chapter 3, remember what Lucifer promised Eve in the Garden of Eden. He told her, he said, "You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." And what was it that was the representation of her future godhood? It was, Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food. That's number 1. Number 2, that it was pleasant to the eyes. Number 3, a tree to be desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. So here we have in this fruit the representation of sin. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. In James chapter 1, we see a scenario here that to me looks like the birth of the man of sin. James chapter 1, verse 15, the Bible says, "Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished," those are the last 3 words spoken by Christ on the cross, "sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death." We have 3 stages of sin here. So in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we have the appearance of who the Bible refers to as the man of sin. "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is." And I want you to follow another pattern here in the scriptures. Here we have the man of sin, who is the total sum of all of mankind's sinfulness. He is the Antichrist. In other words, God is giving to mankind exactly the wages that they earned. The wages of sin is death, and that's who this man represents. He represents death to the entire world. But anyway, follow this pattern in verse 4. "Who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God." That's the first reference. "Or that is worshipped, so that he as God," number 2, "sitteth in the temple of God," number 3, showing himself that he is God, number 4, a reference to the 4th kingdom in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. Now, getting back to this thing we referred to earlier, Jewish mysticism called the Kabbalah. I've read a few pieces of Kabbalah literature, and it is like really, really hard to get. I mean, just the sentences don't even make sense sometimes. And I'm just reading this stuff, and I'm going, I don't figure this out. Most people spend their entire life trying to figure out principles like the Kabbalah and Freemasonry. Bill Schnabelin talked about how, he got into everything trying to receive the Holy Grail or the final illumination, and he was working himself to death to get it. He didn't get it in any of those. He found it in the Lord Jesus Christ. But anyway, the Kabbalah talks about the divine man, or the Adam Kadmon, they refer to it. The union of man and God together. And we already know what that means and what it symbolizes. But they have the thing called the Tree of Life. It's called the Sephiroth, and there are other names for it. But anyway, a Sephiroth, basically, if you look at this symbol and go, what in the world is this talking about? Here we have 10 circles, and they're joined together by 22 lines. Now, here's the explanation of all this. Manly Hall says that the 10 circles joined with the 22 lines form the basis of the 32 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. They also form what's called the divine man. Now, remember this. The 10 circles represent the 10-toed kingdom of Daniel chapter 2. We're going to look at scriptures in a minute. The 22 paths represent the 22 amino acids in our DNA that sequences the genes that make us exactly who we are. So get this imagery again. Here we have human DNA, and God says it's a book and it's perfect and we're not to add to it. And yet added to the human DNA sequence are these 10 kings, or these 10 circles that are fused together with them. And Manly Hall says that forms the 32 degrees of Freemasonry. Let's look at the scriptures and see what the scriptures say about these 10 circles. Daniel chapter 7. And after this I saw in the night visions, behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now the iron teeth represent the iron kingdom that Daniel spoke about in Daniel chapter 2. Revelation 13, and I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Those circles in the Sephirah are represented, or are called the crowns. Revelation chapter 17, verse 12, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Then Daniel chapter 2, verse 42. And the toes of the feet, remember there are 10 toes, were part of iron and part of clay. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. So here we see the biblical account here of what these 10 circles represent. They represent the 10 kings fused together into man's DNA, his 22 amino acid sequencing that makes the genes that make up you and I, fused together to make this new divine man. This same concept is seen then in the logo of the United Nations. Here you have the logo of the United Nations, and you have 32 rectangles that are inside these concentric circles. The point inside the middle of these, or the center point inside the middle of these, would be the 33rd point representing the Antichrist. Remember in the last video we saw Ben-Hadad and these 32 kings that were coming together against God's people. That is exactly what you see in the United Nations logo. The Central Intelligence Agency uses a symbol that is similar to this. It is the symbol of the rose compass. A rose compass typically has 32 points in it. The CIA has this symbol, and notice here that the former director of the CIA, George Herbert Walker Bush, who used to be a member of the Skull and Bone Society, stands in the center point of this rose compass, which represents the 33rd point. Now, I don't believe that George Herbert Walker Bush is the Antichrist, but you see the imagery here. The rose compass was revealed in Dan Brown's previous book, The Da Vinci Code, as a symbol for the rose line, or the fusion of what he said, Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which we now know to be a veiled allegory of the sons of God mingling themselves with the daughters of men and producing a divine race of supermen on the earth. The rose compass on maps refers to that. You typically have a rose compass. You typically have 32 points going into the 32 cardinal directions on planet Earth. And the interesting part about all this is that usually on the north part of most rose compasses on a map, especially older maps, is a symbol called the fleur-de-lis, which is a symbol for the triple helix, or the three-strand DNA. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's always on the north, and the north is the precise location, according to the Scripture, of the coming of this fourth kingdom. Jeremiah chapter 1, "Then the Lord said unto me, out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land." Jeremiah chapter 4, 6 and 7, "Set up the standard toward Zion, retire, stay not, for I will bring evil from the north, and a great destruction. The lion is come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way." Remember when we saw that overhead image of the entire structure of Washington, D.C., we saw that there was the fusion of two triangles together, and one of those triangles pointed directly north along the 77th meridian. One of the stars that can be seen in the night sky is called Polaris, or the North Star. It is a fixed star. Stars were always used to navigate, and the North Star was very important because it was always in the same place no matter where you were in the earth, and no matter when, you could always find the North Star, and it was in the same place. It was always directly north. Going around the North Star is a constellation called Draco, or the dragon. It looks like a winding, writhing dragon or a serpent. Cutting Edge Ministries put out a video called Riddles in Stone. Dan Brown mentions the same thing. Maybe he got it from Riddles in Stone. Is that the interesting thing about the cornerstone laying ceremonies of the Capitol building, the White House, and Washington's monument, these cornerstone ceremonies came under the sign of what's called Caput Draconis, which means the head of the dragon. And under this particular sign, and I don't understand a lot about astrology, but I know that every now and then one set of stars or one set of this kind of conjoins with another set of that, and you have this great illuminated thing in astrology. I don't study astrology too much, but I will tell you that Dan Brown mentions and Riddles in Stone mentions that these two images of the head of the dragon and Virgo, which is the woman, coming together, that these cornerstone laying ceremonies of these buildings in Washington, D.C. always fell under the sign of the dragon fused together with the virgin, the sons of God and daughters of men being brought together. In the divination art of geomancy, the Caput Draconis, or the dragon's head, is a sign for favorable undertakings. Remember the quote there on the back of the dollar bill, "Annuit coeptis," he favors the undertaking or the birth of a new world order. Now, getting back to the image of the Sephiroth, or the Kabbalistic tree of life, I want you to take a good look at this old rendering here of the Sephiroth of the tree of life, and I want you to notice a little bit of imagery here along the sideline. There on the two sides of this, you have two pillars. Those represent Jachin and Boaz, which we now know represent the 23 pairs of chromosomes that we have in all of our cells where our DNA is stored. But look at the makeup of the Sephiroth, the circles joined together with the lines, the 10 kings joined together with the 22 amino acids of our DNA. Take a look then at this overhead view of the National Mall area of Washington, D.C. Down on the bottom there, this is the bottom, going from the bottom to the top, is going from east to west. There on the bottom, you have a rectangular shape. That is Lincoln Square or Lincoln Park, and I'll show you some imagery there in just a few minutes. Going westward, then you have the Capitol. Going up then toward down the National Mall, you have the Jefferson Memorial, you have the White House, you have the Lincoln Memorial, and then between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, you have the newly built World War II monument. If we were to overlay the Sephiroth on top of these points, you will find that the street layout of Washington, D.C. forms precisely the Sephiroth or the Kabbalah tree of life. The idea that the two kingdoms are going to be fused together is recorded for us right in the street layout of Washington, D.C. Now let's go down to the ground a little bit, and intermingled with all of these street layouts and these concentric circles and these corresponding lines, a lot of these places are marked. A lot of the buildings, a lot of the locations that we've seen already are marked with statuary. I mean, it just seems like Washington, D.C. has more statues than the Vatican. I mean, they've got statues of just about everybody famous in America. They've got them depicted somehow, some way in Washington, D.C. The interesting thing about this, and I'm not going to do a full representation of all these statues, but the interesting thing about several of these is that they seem to indicate the same principles that we've been seeing throughout this video. The fusion of opposites, a male figure, a female symbol, and then their offspring or their son representing the Antichrist or the divine man. The two kingdoms fused together. In the statue of James Buchanan, you have a male god on one side and a female statue on the other, with James Buchanan right in the middle of them. This represents Osiris, Isis, and Horus. The same principle that's behind the right-angled triangle you find exactly in this layout here. Now let's take a look at the Boy Scout Memorial, and I want to thank our good friends at Cutting Edge Ministries for providing some of this, number one, the background research, and number two, some of the footage that you're seeing here, because they've done a pretty good job, and I recommend their videos as sort of background into what we're looking at here, particularly the video called Riddles in Stone. But you see here the Boy Scout Memorial. Now, the Boy Scouts were started by a man by the name of William Boyce, who was a 33rd degree Mason. The symbol for the Boy Scouts of America is the fleur-de-lis, which we now know is the symbol for three-strand DNA. In the Boy Scout Memorial in Washington, D.C., you find this scene present. Here you have a statue of a man, a statue of a woman, and a little Boy Scout seemingly as their offspring, forming the sacred triangle. Again, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, those two coming together to form the new offspring or the new man. We look at Lincoln Square. We mentioned it earlier, part of the Sephiroth formation. And here in Lincoln Square, you have a picture, of course, a statue of Abraham Lincoln, the male. You have a statue on the opposite end of a woman, here showing the fusion of the male and the female together. Other statues and memorials spread about through Washington, D.C. We have the Lincoln Memorial, which is a Greek temple. Now remember, a temple is a picture of the human body. And it has a statue of Abraham Lincoln inside of it, and he appears as a god inside of this temple. So here, get this imagery. We have a temple with a god inside of it as part of the statuary of the complex of Washington, D.C. Now, I've been to this particular location there, and you know what I do is I count things. And I had a friend with me, and we started from the reflection pool, which we'll talk about in a minute, walking up the steps to the Lincoln Memorial. It's exactly 46 steps up there. That's the exact number of chromosomes that we have where our DNA is stored. Then we move across the pond to Jefferson Memorial. This was designed after Jefferson's own design. The image of it is that of a Roman pantheon. A pantheon, the two words there, pan and theon, which is basically theos, is the idea that this temple is a temple for all of the gods. That's why you have the word pan there. So a pantheon is a temple where all of the gods dwell. Here again, think about this. The temple being a picture of the human body, and it is the dwelling place of the gods. There's like another term for this. It's called demon possession. But here again in the Jefferson Memorial, we see the dwelling place of all the gods, or the fusion together of the gods in the human body joining together. That's an image of Daniel's fourth kingdom in Daniel chapter 2. Often around these monuments you see what's called a reflecting pool. Notice the imagery here, Washington's monument being reflected inside the pool. Now this is meant to be the concept of As above, so below. We talked about that concept in the last video. The phrase or the concept of as below basically is a concept showing the two kingdoms fusing together. The heavenly kingdom with the earthly realm being joined together. That's what that is at the heart of the reflecting pool. There is a pagan practice that corresponds with this called scrying. It is the practice of gazing into a mirror or gazing into a pool of water or sometimes a pool of mercury in order to make contact with the gods. That is the same principle that you have in the reflecting pool, as above, so below. Now, going along with this same concept of as above, so below, you remember we talked about in the last video how that Dan Brown had put into the story that the villain of the lost symbol, a person by the name of Moloch, which was the god of, killing your babies in the Old Testament. Anyway, this villain called Moloch had taken the grand master of the worshipful master of the House of the Temple Lodge in Washington, D.C., a guy named Peter Solomon. That's just a made-up name. Anyway, took and cut his hand off, and he made his hands make the symbol of as above, so below. He took this hand and he placed it right in the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The fingers were pointed up. Dan Brown makes this big deal about this. The fingers were pointing up to a mural that's on top of the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. That mural happens to be called the Apotheosis of Washington. Now, here's an interesting thing about the phrase apotheosis. Remember, everything that we've seen before is that Freemasonry and the symbols of Freemasonry always point you to the divining of mankind, or making a mankind into a god. The phrase apotheosis means turning a man into a god. And so when you look at the mural of the apotheosis, you have George Washington now being deified after his death. This exact concept comes to us from Genesis chapter 3. We mentioned it earlier. This is what the serpent promised to Eve. For God doth know that in the day that ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So the very thing that the devil promised to Eve was that she, through partaking of this particular fruit, would become a god. This same concept is in the Mormon church. And if you don't know a little bit about Mormon history, well, then I'll tell you that Joseph Smith and the early leaders of the Mormon church all became Freemasons when they were in Nauvoo, Illinois. In fact, a lot of the rituals and symbols that are in the Mormon church are clearly Masonic. But the Mormon church teaches that man, when he dies, if he is a good Mormon and he has this Hieros-Gamos marriage, this sacred ritual with his wife, I mean, that goes back to the thing we saw about the pentagram. But anyway, if he has this sacred union with his wife, when they die, they will be married together, and they will become gods over their own planet. This is exactly the same lie that Lucifer promised to Eve in the Garden of Eden. And if you remember from earlier works that we've done in our video, DNA, Jesus Christ, DNA, and the Holy Bible, and the Mother of All Secrets, you will see that in Genesis chapter 3, in your King James Bible, the exact number of words that Lucifer spoke to Eve in the Garden of Eden was 46. That's the exact same number of chromosomes that you have where all of your DNA is stored. Getting back to this mural, the Apotheosis of Washington, you see here, we're going to flip it around a little bit so you can see that Washington is surrounded by 13 goddesses. Remember, that's Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. They're holding a banner that says E pluribus unum. Now, we sort of adopted that as the whole theme of our country. You know, all these people from all over the world coming into the United States of America. And all those sounds real good, but the real meaning of E pluribus unum, out of many, one, is this fusion of the two kingdoms that are opposite each other in Daniel chapter 2, that Daniel's fourth kingdom fusing themselves with the seed of men. Then we see George Washington there, robed as a god there, surrounded by his celestial virgins and all of these other gods that are surrounding him there. And I want you to notice that one hand is extended upward, one hand is extended downward and outward. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that at one time, there was commissioned a statue of George Washington that was supposed to sit right underneath this mural in the capital of Washington, D.C. It again followed that theme of the apotheosis of George Washington. And here he is, this statue, which was moved because some people thought it was indecent to have a president of the United States cloaked in a robe, half naked. But here you see George Washington making the same hand gestures, as above, so below. So the symbolism here of a statue of George Washington on the floor of the rotunda, and then the mural of George Washington up in the sky, was meant to symbolize as above, so below. But a more curious element of the gestures that Washington is making, both in this statue and in the mural in the rotunda, is that they mirror exactly the image of the god of the Knights Templar called Baphomet. Baphomet is the fusion of opposites. He is male and female together. He is part man and part beast together. He is light and darkness fused together. One hand points up, one hand points down. And you see there the symbol. He has male and female parts on his body. And you see, of course, also there the symbol of DNA. Now let's look outside of the Capitol building. The Capitol of the United States of America is probably one of the most recognized symbols, not only in this country, but in the entire world. A lot of times you'll be watching newscasts, and when they're doing a story about politics in Washington, generally they will show you an image of some kind of the Capitol building of Washington, D.C. Most people don't know the nature of why this building was designed the way it was. We've already seen with Lincoln's Memorial and Jefferson's Memorial that they were modeled after early temples. Well, the Capitol building is no different. The Capitol building, or at least the top part that you see there with the columns, that was designed to represent the temple of the goddess Vesta. The Temple of Vesta was the home of, you've probably heard of, the Vestal Virgins. They were the forerunners of nuns in the Roman Catholic Church. The goddess Vesta was the goddess of the hearth and fire. Now, something that you don't see, and I caught on to this when I was doing the research for this, is that I noticed that in most renditions of the Temple of Vesta, they were pretty much most noted by the circular structure, and especially the columns or the pillars that supported it. What we see in the Capitol building, however, is slightly different. We see not only the circular structure of the outer part of the building, but we see a massive dome sitting on top of it. That dome, according to Manly Hall, represents the human skull. He says the exact science of human regeneration is the lost key of masonry. For when the spirit fire is lifted up through the 33 degrees or segments of the spinal column and enters into the domed chamber of the human skull. So Manly Hall reveals that the domed chamber on the top of the Capitol building represents the human skull. Remember from the last video, we found out that the skull is a symbol or an emblem of the Antichrist. So I want you to get this imagery. Here again, once again, we're seeing the fusion of the opposites. We have the columns, the 72 columns that go around the top of the Capitol building. That represents the temple of the goddess, Vesta, the female. We have the domed skull on top of it. That represents the male, or Osiris, as it were, the sun god. Those of them fused together into one temple or one building that is the Capitol. Here again, this exact imagery is seen in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. One of our traditions that we have in this country is that when a president dies and is laid to rest, he is generally taken to, here again, we follow the sequence here. In the case of John F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's body was taken first to the White House, then it traveled that sacred path of Pennsylvania Avenue. Remember, the hypotenuse of the right-angled triangle representing the divine man. Kennedy's body was taken down Pennsylvania Avenue, taken to the Capitol to sit in the rotunda directly underneath the apotheosis of George Washington. The symbolism here is obvious. Here we have the body of a dead president or a dead person that there is hopes that he will live again. This is a picture of the Antichrist who is in the pit, and he is going to be revealed by being released out of the pit one of these days. So the imagery of as above, so below being seen when a president lies in state in the rotunda of the Capitol of Washington, D.C. Now remember earlier we referred to the House of the Temple Lodge in Washington, D.C. This is the headquarters for the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Its location is exactly on the 77th meridian. Now remember, that number and that line of longitude represents the birth or the revealing of the Antichrist. Its street address is 1733 16th Street. There's that number 33 again. And it lies exactly 13 blocks north of the White House. Remember, the number 13 symbolizes the name written on Mystery Babylon's forehead, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Outside of the House of the Temple Lodge are two sphinxes. These are meant to represent the two pillars of Freemasonry, or the two pillars in Solomon's temple, Jachin and Boaz. Remember, Jachin and Boaz are 23 cubits tall. They represent the 46 chromosomes where our DNA is stored. Remember also that Hiram Abiff, upon realizing that he was going to be murdered, hid the lost word of Freemasonry, or the secrets of building the temple, inside of Jachin and Boaz. These two pillars of Jachin and Boaz are figured as sphinxes, which is a fusion of man and beast together. This most sacred lodge to Freemasons in America is referred to as a temple. Remember, the temple is a picture of the human body. In fact, on the outside door of this lodge, it says, Masonry builds its temples in the hearts of mankind. It is surrounded by 33 columns, each one of them 33 feet tall. The building itself was designed to model one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. It is a step pyramid on top of a Greek temple. It is also a picture of a triangle sitting on top of a square that we see in the Mason's apron. Albert Pike says that the pyramid represents the heavenly realm, and the Greek temple below represents the earthly realm, or the female. Literally a body that is the fusion of heaven and earth. It is the temple of the godhood of man. And as we discovered in our last video, you remember there are 33 columns on this Greek temple. There are 13 steps on this pyramid. This corresponds with the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and the 13 degrees of the York Rite of Freemasonry. When those two numbers are added together, you end up with the number 46, the exact number of chromosomes where our DNA is stored. This House of the Temple Lodge is mirrored in other buildings across the country. It is seen in the Civil Courts Building in St. Louis, Missouri, the Soldiers Memorial in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the City Hall of Los Angeles, California. When you enter the door of the temple, you're entering the atrium of the temple. Surrounding this atrium are decorative swastikas. A swastika is an ancient symbol for transformation. Actually, the swastika is meant to represent the X chromosome. And notice that on this X, or this cross, you have lines that are pointing in opposite directions, showing the fusion of opposites in the X chromosome where our DNA is stored. These swastikas are also seen as part of the outer decoration of the Masonic Temple in St. Louis, Missouri. Also emblazoned on the wall in the atrium of this building is a giant cross, or an X, representing the X chromosome. You might remember that this also was the symbol for Adolf Hitler's Nazi party, the swastika. And you have to think about what kind of spirit was leading Adolf Hitler, and what were they trying to do in Germany. Remember, Hitler was all about a master race, an elevated manhood. Once you got rid of all the creepy people that he referred to, like Jews, then you could have the supreme master race. And we know for a fact that a lot of Hitler's scientists were working on genetics. A swastika emblem is also seen in the layout of the airport in Denver, Colorado, that is called the New World Airport. Now, in the main part of the house of the Temple Lodge is, of course, the temple room. Now, this is where all the initiations and all the ceremonies take place in this particular lodge. I've been in this room. They'll take you on a nice little tour. You go up a set of steps, and there's a bust of Albert Pike. And then on both sides of you, and I recognized this as soon as I got there, was what's called the winding staircase. This, of course, is said to be a model of the winding staircase that was in the Temple of Solomon. But Masonry also uses the winding staircase in its imagery as the, quote, path of initiation or the journey of illumination, the path to man's godhood. This, of course, this winding staircase is just a picture or a symbol for the winding ladder of man's DNA. And so naturally, I'm standing there looking at these two winding staircases and I'm going, okay, I understand this. There's two of them. And as I began to walk up those steps, I was counting. There are exactly 23 steps on each side of this winding staircase, total 46. The exact number of chromosomes in the human body where the DNA is stored. This winding staircase takes you into the temple room. Now, I've been in this room, and its ornate design just staggers your mind. As you walk into the room, the first thing that you see beyond the altar, which is the center point of the temple, you see the throne of the worshipful master, which of course represents the Antichrist. It just happens to be a throne that is 33 feet tall. Opposite of this throne is a pipe organ. Now, it took me a while to figure this one out, but I think I got it. Ezekiel chapter 28 gives us a description of Lucifer in his pre-fallen state. Notice what is said concerning Lucifer. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering. The sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. I believe these pipes are a symbol of Lucifer, the fallen angel himself. When you stand directly in the center or at the altar of the temple room, you see above you a giant glass ceiling. Now, Dan Brown referred to this in the lost symbol, and that thing is real. That is to allow the illumination of the gods into the house of Freemasonry. And it also is the symbol of, as above, so below. Now we're going to take you on our last little step of our journey here and looking at all these monuments. And I hope that we've uncovered some mysteries in your mind for you as to exactly what is the nature of all these monuments and buildings and streets that are in Washington, D.C. and sort of what they mean. We're talking about the revealing of the Antichrist and a revealing of a new world order in the last days. Remember that Washington, D.C. is a book written without words. It's written in symbols. When you know the key to the symbols, sort of like the Rosetta Stone to Egyptian hieroglyphics, when you know the key, then you can unlock all the symbols. And this is what we're going to do with Washington's monument. Of course, you remember it's a giant obelisk, which basically represents Baal's shaft. It is a phallus symbol. It is a symbol for the male. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of these buildings in Washington, D.C. were laid in a Masonic cornerstone ritual. The cornerstone of Washington's monument was laid on July 4th, 1848. Now that is exactly, here's this number, 72 years after the signing of the Declaration. Remember, the number 72 is a veiled reference to the pentagram. If you were to take the date 7/4/1848, that equals 32. That is the 32 paths of the Sephiroth, or the 32 degrees of Freemasonry. Even if we were to go back to July 4th, 1776, we take the numbers 7 for the month of July, 4 for the day, 1776. Those numbers added together also equal the number 32. Here to me now is one of the most interesting aspects of the monument called Washington's Monument, that giant obelisk that sits in the dead center of everything that is Washington, D.C. The structure itself, the height of it, is exactly 555 feet tall. To me, this is significant because remember, everything in Masonry is pointing you to the opposite of Jesus Christ, the 77th meridian, and all these images that we've seen so far. In your King James Bible, God showed me this several years ago. The exact number of times that the name Christ is mentioned in the King James Bible is exactly 555. This same number, as we saw in our last video, is emblazoned on a third-degree Masonic tracing board on top of a casket. Remember, that casket contains the body or the essence of the Mason's lost word or the Antichrist. 555. The capstone at the top of Washington's monument is exactly 3,300 pounds. And even Dan Brown, in an interview with NBC, stated that this 3,300-pound capstone on top of the Washington's monument is to be a picture of the number 33. Dan Brown tells us in The Lost Key that the main character, Robert Langdon, who is this symbologist, who, as he sees symbols, he kind of gets it. He is taken on a path by Peter Solomon up to the top of Washington's monument, and lo and behold, he finds himself going upward in a spiral staircase. There is a spiral staircase that is in Washington's monument in Washington, D.C. This represents the path to illumination, or the path to godhood, the apotheosis of mankind, turning men into gods. Now, one of the most important aspects of Washington's monument and what it symbolizes is not so much as what is at the top of the monument, but what's underneath it. Dan Brown reveals that in the cornerstone of Washington's monument, the cornerstone was hollow. You know, most cornerstones they put on buildings are hollow, and they usually put different things in them to be preserved forever. Well, in this particular case, the cornerstone is not evident on the outside of the Washington's monument anywhere. It's buried down deep in the ground. The cornerstone is the emblem of the coffin. What's inside of that coffin? The lost word of Masonry, symbolized by the Holy Bible. This is the lost symbol that Dan Brown refers to in his book. He teaches that the Bible is a symbol for the lost word of Freemasonry. Now, let's put together everything that we've learned so far. The Bible itself is a symbol for man's DNA, his two-strand DNA. The Old Testament being one strand, the New Testament being the second strand of DNA. And God said it's perfect. Don't add anything to it. And yet Masonry conceals the fact that the plan of all ages is to add a third strand to man's DNA, a fifth base to the 4 base pairs that we have in our DNA, 10 kings to the 22 amino acids that we have. One of the things that Dan Brown mentions in the lost symbol is that the Bible was never meant to be taken literally. It is merely a symbol, an allegory, a myth. But I'm here to tell you that the Bible is true from the very beginning. If you were to believe the story of the lost symbol, if you were to believe the parables and the myths and the allegories of Freemasonry, then you would believe that mankind is going to ascend up the ladder of illumination and bring himself to godhood. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Man is incapable of being any more than just a man. Remember those X chromosomes that I've been showing you throughout this video? That X chromosome is a perfect picture of the cross of Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus died on a cross because God knows that man would never be able to ascend the steps into godhood on his own. One must come and do it for him, and that one was Jesus Christ. Jesus himself said in John chapter 3, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And Romans 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 23, being born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible, by the word of God, which liveth and abideth forever. The question may be in your mind, is the Bible literal? Is it, as Dan Brown and Freemasons say, simply an allegory or something that is not true? You have to decide whether you're going to believe the Bible is to be the truth of the Word of God, or is to be a bunch of stories and myths and fables about how we can elevate ourselves. And this goes back to the beginning, what we talked about the two cities. Washington, D.C. represents the city that is on the earth, the Tower of Babel, Babylon itself, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. However, God has a better way. His city, heavenly Jerusalem, descends down from heaven to bridge the gap between sinful man and a sinless God. And that is only accomplished through the cross of Jesus Christ. Keep these things in mind. If you want to study Freemasonry, study Freemasonry. But if you want to look at the